All right, thanks everyone for joining us. For those of you who have been coming to some of the talks sponsored by the International Human Rights Clinic and the International Law Society, Human Rights Law Society, and this one's also being sponsored by the Law School's international programs. We are having a series of lunch conversations and talks about the current pandemic that we are in and its implications on international law, global cooperation, and just the general question of the world community in law. So today we are very lucky, as always, to have Professor Tom Ginsburg talk with us about COVID and states of emergency, and more generally about the legal responses to COVID around the world. So with that, I'm going to open it up to Professor Ginsburg. He's going to talk to us for a bit, and then hopefully we can have a conversation.
Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone. And I hope everyone is doing well wherever you may be, staying safe and such. So I've been following around the world the reactions to COVID, the legal reactions. I mean, the metaphor I use is, of course, this pandemic touches, by definition, everyone on Earth, most everyone on Earth. But it's also confronting different governmental systems. And just as we sometimes say that human beings, have certain resiliences that allow them to survive diseases and are actually somewhat mysterious in the case of this virus, I think the same is true of government systems. And so we're seeing very interesting set of responses, which I'd like to talk about within constitutional democracies. We're seeing some international law responses, I think fewer helpful ones. And then we're also seeing a small number of states, and I think it is a small number, which are taking advantage of the virus to deepen authoritarianism, or sort of succumb, if you will, to the virus. And I can talk about that as well. So that I think what I'll do is, obviously this raises the general issue of emergency powers, right? Which are by definition situations which you couldn't contemplate in advance. And there's a long and old debate in constitutional theory about whether emergency powers can be actually actively restrained or adequately restrained by law in advance. We have this kind of idea of a regime of exception, right? A special state, a state of emergency, which governments can declare, and that gives them additional powers with which to address the emergency. They are usually temporally limited, and are subject to some oversight. I guess that might be the way to think about a generic state of emergency regime. The idea goes back all the way to the Romans, of course, and is something that was a central part of their constitutional governance, but is incorporated into something like 90% of national constitutions now. So it's a very common way of thinking about this. And then what that requires, particularly when it comes to human rights, is that the government formally declare a state of emergency. And this could either be, by the way, under the Constitution or under legislation, and they take slightly different forms. They have different implications, I think, for the separation of powers and such. But the basic paradigm is you're suspending normal rules, which will, in some cases, allow you to infringe on rights more than you could in normal times. Now, international law, international human rights law, particularly the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, as well as the European and American conventions, have what they call regimes of derogation. So the idea is that a state can go into a state of emergency, can suppress some rights as necessary to fight the emergency, and they are supposed to notify various bodies. So in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, they're supposed to notify the United Nations, I think, High Commissioner. And in the case of the regional treaties, they notify, the Council of Europe or the Organization of American States. Actually, what's really interesting right now is we're seeing very few states notify those international bodies that they are in a state of emergency. But when we look at the national level, we see something like 170 countries have declared some kind of state of emergency, either constitutionally or through legislation. So we're seeing kind of a little bit of a disjunct where the primary response is at the national level. And I think that's primarily what I'm going to talk about. So there's this idea of a special regime of exception. And it's really important in political theory. It's contested, as I was suggesting at the outset, as to whether or not you can actually adequately address it by law. Professor Posner, for example, is on the left-sided view, and I think I agree with him on this, that, you know, there's just going to be powers that you sometimes need to exercise, which just don't fit in the conventional legal framework. And we have seen that in the response to this virus. So even Taiwan, which I think is the jurisdiction with the best response of any major country, hardly any cases, they locked down the island quickly, very good, very effective response. It wasn't clear that they could take all the steps that they did when they did. And so they passed a special coronavirus statute that was retroactive to allow them to do some of the things that they did. And so I guess that illustrates that the law kind of runs out, right? And so from a rule of law perspective, if you're really a formalist, you might be really troubled by that. My own view is that the key things are not the actual legality in a formal sense, but those kind of broader principles, rule of law principles. Is there accountability mechanisms and oversight? Is there time limitation on the emergency? You know, are there, you know, do we observe that the restrictions are being deployed in a way that violates sort of fundamental ideas of, let's say, equality, like our political opponents being targeted? And if you see that, then you know something's amiss. But it doesn't bother me, and I don't think it bothers Posner, that you know, sometimes the governments have to take steps that aren't, formally speaking, legal at the time they do it, as long as they're ex post justified. Now, he and I have a really big disagreement. He doesn't know this, but I'm writing a law review article taking him on, so I'll have to tell him pretty soon. So one of his earlier contributions is something that he calls a book called The Executive Unbound. And his idea is that emergencies illustrate a general theme in modern governance, which is it's so complicated and there's so many trade-offs to be done that basically all power is going to executives. And courts and legislatures are just incapable of restraining them. And therefore, the only restraints, he and his co-author, Adrian Vermeule at Harvard, argue, are really political in nature. And that's a view that, you know, kind of goes back to the famous German theorist Carl Schmitt, one of the political theorists that all liberals have to wrestle with and, you know, can never quite defeat. And he's the guy everyone invokes during emergencies, because he's the one who said that whoever gets to declare the emergency is the person who has the sovereign power in any system. And so what Eric, what Posner and Vermeule are saying is, yeah, that's right. And executives are the ones who do so. So they're ultimately just accumulating all this power. The only hope is to constrain them, not with law, but politics. So that's kind of the thesis I wanted to test. And what I've been doing is going and looking around the world at what the reactions have been. And I think that they are wrong. That in fact, what we're observing is some legislative oversight, but a tremendous oversight and accountability being performed by constitutional courts in many jurisdictions. And I'll give some examples. That instead of just deferring automatically to what the executive is doing, which is kind of a common argument if you think about wartime in the United States, right? The history of courts and the Supreme Court in states of war is that, yeah, they do tend to defer. They blessed, you know, the internment of Japanese Americans and the suspension of the habeas corpus in the Civil War. So that's, I think, what's motivating this argument that courts just will defer in emergencies. That's not what we're seeing. So what are courts doing around the world? One thing they are doing is making sure that the procedures are being properly followed for declaring a state of emergency. So one example, I think Kosovo told the government when they tried to declare a state of emergency, the Kosovo Constitutional Court just said, no, you don't need to do that. You can deal with this crisis through ordinary law. And until you show us otherwise, we're going to assume that you have to use ordinary law. So that's an example of just making sure that, you know, the predicate, I guess, is met before turning to a state of emergency. Israel was a really interesting case because the Israeli government has been, those of you who followed, they've had like 3 elections and they couldn't compose a government. And then this virus hit. And the prime minister, who was under indictment himself, was postponing, you know, closing the courts so that his case could be postponed. And they were proposing to use people's cell phone data to track cases, which is really an important tool for contact tracing, right? If that's a tool to fight the virus, you know, in the abstract, that's something you want to do, but it obviously runs up against civil liberties. And in Israel, the only agency which can trace cell phones is the Secret Service, and only for purposes of counterterrorism. So the government said, well, you know, it's an emergency. We're just going to let them trace infected people as well. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. First of all, you can't do that by government decree. You've got to get authorization from the legislative committee, which they then got. And then a few weeks later, the court said, no, you can't even do that just with, you know, legislative authorization. That requires actual law, right? Formal legislation. So this is kind of the principle of legality, which is, you know, obviously a fundamental one. And we see the court, you know, in a time of crisis, telling a legislature that it can't, telling a government that it can't do what it wants to do. Other courts have told governments that they have to report back with findings every week to justify the continued state of emergency, even though that's not required in the formal emergency provisions in the Constitution. And this leads to another approach that I think courts are taking, and it's the principle, which many of you have run across, the principle of proportionality, right? So this is like an underlying fundamental, you know, universal principle of law. We don't use it much in the United States. We tend to think of our constitutional rights as being subject to balancing tests, in which we're weighing the state interest versus the individual, and usually the individual loses, of course, when you frame it that way. The proportionality test, of course, is a test that's used in international law and in constitutional courts around the world, which is much more refined. And what it requires is that any restriction on rights be justified as being proportional, and it should be no more restrictive than it needs to be. And so that's an example. The Slovenian court I mentioned is one where the court is saying, yeah, of course it's an emergency. You need to do what you have to do, but you have to show us each week that the continued lockdown is actually necessary, you know, with data and such. And that leads to a whole set of cases where courts have been scrutinizing the steps that are taken, looking at lockdowns, right, which are obviously, you know, infringements on rights to freedom of movement and freedom of assembly, and ensuring that they're implemented in non-discriminatory ways and ways that are doing the least harm, I suppose, to people's rights. So on the non-discrimination stuff, there were some cases in Germany where protesters wanted to get together, and of course all assemblies were banned, and the Constitutional Court said, no, you can have assemblies, you just have to observe the social distancing regulations, which makes some sense to me. By the way, I just have to make a comment on the United States. We're seeing these protests by, frankly, fringe groups. I might say lunatic fringe groups, but I don't want to offend anybody, in various state capitals. And, you know, look, it's to me, when I look at what's going on in the American states, I don't see instances in which these restrictions are being targeted at particular groups. And so to me, those protests are, you know, kind of silly. I mean, obviously they indeed where all of our rights are being in some sense infringed, but they seem like basically reasonable ones. The only things which I think have been violations might be there's a case in Kentucky involving a church service where people wanted to have an Easter service in their cars, and the state came and cracked down on them. That seemed kind of silly to me and unnecessary. But for the most part, and now I'm slipping into a comment on the United States, most of the rights discourse in the United States hasn't been done through courts. We don't see any big rulings, or not too many yet. It's mostly just kind of the political branches and the states and the federal government in dialogue with each other, which is a kind of way that constitutionalism actually gets implemented. And so I basically am not that sympathetic with ideas that we're being, totally restrained in some kind of way, especially when you compare with many other countries where the lockdowns are much more severe. So courts have proven themselves able to manage these lockdowns, making sure, in one case, in Bosnia, they decided that a lockdown restricted to the old was discriminatory, and so you couldn't do that. You can just make recommendations. In some cases, courts have actually demanded action by governments that haven't been doing very much. So a good case there is Brazil, which is run by a kind of nut job, frankly, who is a populist guy who is thinks the coronavirus is just the flu. He's like made a show of going and shaking people's hands and was insisting that it was fake. He has a conspiracy theory about it. And the Supreme Court of Brazil basically enjoined him from making those statements told the government that he could not end the lockdown by decree, and that states could actually respond. And so that's a pretty interesting case where you have, a national leader who's kind of acting erratically, and the court steps in and says, no, you can't do that, and he listened, right? So that really suggests that this idea that the executive is unbound is kind of wrong, at least in this crisis. There doesn't seem to be that much evidence of it. In some other cases, courts also demanded action in somewhat odd ways. The Indian Supreme Court demanded that testing be provided for free by private companies that produce the test. So, it's one thing to say the government has to provide something for free, but to enjoin a private company to produce tests for no money was quite a far step indeed. And of course, what happened? Testing companies stopped producing tests. So that was a perverse case. But then they came back and they come to some kind of understanding. I think the government's going to pay for the first 500 million tests or something like that. Now, let me just turn briefly before opening it up to talk about the authoritarian term. So the great problem with the emergency rule, the fear, of course, is that, yeah, we have to delegate to the executive to take some steps. We don't know what those are going to be. So there's a moral hazard that's obviously at play there, where the executive might use the period of emergency to entrench their own power, to arrest political opponents, etc. And that's an old fear going back to the Romans. So how's it played out? Well, we have seen some countries where political opponents are targeted. In a lot of countries, they passed kind of fake news laws about the coronavirus and then use those to go after journalists. That's what's happened in Cambodia, I believe in Indonesia. China has gone after its opponents, not in China because they don't need any special power to do that, but in Hong Kong. So they used the emergency to justify the arrest of basically all the leading Hong Kong opposition politicians for actions that took place months ago with demonstrations. And so it really is, a major step in the end of civil liberties in Hong Kong. And it is, a case where they're just making a pretextual use of the crisis. So that's clearly a fear. And I suppose the most prominent case is Hungary, which has been ruled by a prime minister who's been sort of a paradigm of backsliding government for some time. And he used the coronavirus pandemic to get the legislature to pass a law delegating to him all power to fight the virus forever. He can rule by decree. He can set aside any law he wants. There's no temporal limitation. And he can, in order to undo this law, requires a 2/3 vote in the parliament itself by its own terms. So that has really turned Hungary into, I think a pretty clear example of a dictatorship. How is he using the power? It's rather strange. He kicked out everyone from hospitals, like heart disease patients and stuff. He kicked out all the sick to make room for the coronavirus patients, which there aren't very many of. So and he's also targeting his political opponents. So we do see those kind of cases. And there's some other examples too. Still, when I survey the whole scheme of the world, I think that generally speaking, democracies have responded relatively democratically. And partly that is because of these other institutions, courts, subnational governments, legislatures that are fighting back. I will give one example there, which is an African country, Malawi, where there was a really contested presidential election last year. And so the current president, claimed to have won, but there were so many irregularities that they ordered a new vote, which is going to be held in June. And that president used the virus to say, well, we're going to have a lockdown and we're probably going to have to suspend the election. And the constitutional court in that country said, no, we can't have a lockdown at all. No lockdown in Malawi, because the fear is that the president will use the lockdown to prevent political organization against him and to redo this election he stole. It's a pretty remarkable thing for a court to do, and shows you that in fact executives are bound. They're not unbound in any real sense. I just say one last thing. I'm talking quite a bit, but I want to say one last thing, which is one of the interesting things is the extent to which subnational actors are major constraints. And they didn't really think much about this, Posner and Vermeule. But if you think about it, in our country, obviously, the governors are the ones who are getting much of the credit for effective response. There's been somewhat of a battle between the national and state governments in many, many ways, a lot of tension. It doesn't seem to be helping our response. What's interesting to me is that we're not alone. Even in states which don't have federalism, we're seeing in this crisis that local actors are the ones who are responding most effectively. So in Chile, the mayors demanded more severe steps than the national government was going to take. In Japan, which is a case where the Constitution doesn't allow for states of emergency, actually a governor declared a state of emergency in the first province in Hokkaido where the first case came down. And, you know, it's not, I can't quite figure out what power he used to do that, but he did it and it was fairly effective. Though I will say one last thing about that interesting case is that it was so effective that he ended the state of emergency after 21 days and then subsequently has had to put it back in place. And that might be a warning for us who, you know, are about to, you know, reopen in many, many states, maybe some of the ones where you are, that you know, this thing is not gone, unfortunately. And that means that we're going to have to continue to watch. Now, my own view, final thing I'll say is that the longer this goes on, the longer these restrictions remain in place, the more scrutiny there's going to be by courts and other actors insisting on accountability. So I think in general, the world has come away okay. The international human rights machinery has not been a huge part of it, but that's okay. It's a backup to national governments in any case. And I'll stop there and maybe turn it back to you, Claudia.
Hey, great. Thank you. So I'm going to give folks a little bit of time to raise their virtual hands and get their cameras on if they can. I guess I want to ask you and maybe start at the beginning of your talk. Do you have any concerns, not about authoritarian governments really taking the opportunity to sort of, you know, dig their hands in and do what they've been planning to do all along, but just about governments that are democratic governments, but that take certain liberties during this period of states of emergency that then become the new normal for a population? So a lot of these tests that you were talking about, or protections, you know, accountability, transparency, time limitations, a lot of those things are relative, right? And populations can get used to different things over time. And with the COVID outbreak in particular, because it's not, you know, and I'd have to go through my head and think of all the different kinds of states of emergency, but it's not such a contained event, and it can be declared as much longer in certain countries, right, depending on what's going on. Do you see, or have you seen, or do you have any concerns that, you know, in terms of civil liberties, we'll just sort of move a little bit more to the right, and the expectations of people move a little bit more to the right in a way that exists post-COVID, and then will require some more work to move us back to where we are now?
I'm not sure I'd say to the right, because at least in the United States, that's civil liberty. But,
not to the right politically, just to in a different direction.
Yeah, on the side of repression. So yeah, right. I think there's a lot of discourse about that. And I think it's impossible to say. Like, every crisis obviously leaves a residue. We're still at the state of war, you know, that was declared, and exercising powers that were adopted after 9/11, 20 years later. And so, you know, there's no doubt that these things have residual effects. However, I think it's impossible to say without confronting the actual biology and the epidemiology of it, right? So you can imagine that once you know, even if a vaccine takes years, if a treatment is found that's available in rich countries, you know, then you're going to see in those countries pushback, right? Because people are just getting pretty antsy already and willing to take greater risks now, even when the risk is exactly the same that it was, you know, 8 weeks ago. And so I think there's some chance of it, but I'm not really that convinced that it's going to happen in a liberty infringing way, precisely because I don't think many of the restrictions have infringed on core liberties any more than the normal state of American life. You know, let's say we were meeting in person in January in the law school, and the police came and arrested all of us and threw us in jail for 4 days, right, in violation of our constitutional rights. We'd eventually get out, you know, and then we would seek some sort of remedy. And that lawsuit would, you know, much better than me, Professor Flores, take many years. And maybe we'd get some money from an insurance company that, you know, was insuring the City of Chicago Police Department. people's constitutional rights are violated all the time, and there aren't very many good mechanisms in normal life to deal with it. So I think the salience of this one and these restrictions actually will mean that we might even be in a better rights place at the end of it. And there I'm thinking of some of the things regarding decarceration and the attention on the prisons. And these were ideas that, and it just shows you, I think, the power of ideas, you know. When Angela Davis came up with the idea of decarceration, everyone thought she was crazy, including me. And now we're seriously, you know, that because that idea was available, it seems to make some sense at times like this, just in cost benefit terms. So it's very interesting. And I'm not as worried maybe as I should be, but I tend to be an optimistic person.
Well, part of the reason that might be the case in the US is because we've had such an ineffective response to the pandemic, right? There are other countries that have increased surveillance in ways that are really justifiable within the pandemic, but then might be a problem later.
Yeah, the cell phone tracking is a big one. And even in the United States, by the way, the cell phone tracking is quite, it's regulated by state law. I don't know if many of you know that. So you could be, I'm not sure what time it is, but it is still regulated by state law. I'm just teasing you. So, you know, anyway, that is one to watch. I think you're right.
That was a question for Alexa, by the way. She knows what time it is.
Okay.
All right, EJ.
I didn't know it was you. I wouldn't have said anything.
No, it wasn't Maya.
Professor Ginsburg, I had a quick question about kind of related to your law review article, but are we noticing a difference in how you know, state actors are handling the coronavirus based on whether they're a parliamentarian executive or a presidential executive? And the basic idea being that, like, you know, parliamentarian representative democracies tend to have a few more checks on their executive. And so do we see these institutional barriers on the executive allowing those countries to feel more comfortable with giving their executive more discretion to handle the coronavirus as they see fit? Excluding the US, I think we're kind of an outlier out there, but do we see this kind of weird interplay where, like, the more institutional barriers, the more comfortable we are letting the executive run free and handle this as they may?
So that's a great question. I was looking into some data about it. In general, not yet. I mean, the Hungarian case I mentioned, that's a parliamentary system, at least nominally. You know, China, Cambodia, these are parliamentary systems. The one interesting thing, I was looking at some data on when you declare states of emergency and what the effects thereafter are on civil liberties. And it seems that research seems to show that the key determinant of whether you actually declare a state of emergency is not whether you're parliamentary or presidential, but how autocratic you were to begin with. So those countries which are already kind of on the slope towards autocracy are more likely to declare a state of emergency with worse consequences for civil liberties and human rights. And so that's an interesting finding, because it suggests that as international lawyers, we shouldn't be encouraging these derogations from human rights. We shouldn't be encouraging declarations of state of emergency. Try to deal with things through ordinary legislation. It's actually a much better model. And it's interesting because in the United States, we don't actually have anything called a constitutional state of emergency. All we have are these statutes, which we've been living under for decades anyway. That's the new normal and has been for a long time in so many areas. That seems to be actually maybe okay from the civil liberties point of view.
All right, Eric.
Hi. I was wondering if you have noticed commonalities among the countries or even the states, because we've seen kind of variants of this across the United States itself. So variants among the governments that have, or commonalities among the governments that have ceded like control of the crisis, or even just like the public face of the crisis to public health officials. Like Washington State, for example, seemed to give all the power and the TV time to their local health officials, while like New York State is putting Cuomo in charge. And it seems like countries are doing it differently to better and worse effect.
You know, that's really interesting. I don't know. This is kind of a difficult variable to look at cross-nationally, but to the extent that the leader is a charismatic, you know, person who wants to swallow up all the attention, might actually correlate with worse outcomes, you know, in a health sense. So, but I don't know. I haven't seen any research on it. I think it's a pretty good theory. Yeah. And one you could even do, as you say, even within American states, right? you have some kind of model which would predict how many cases there would be without particular interventions and try to show it. There was, I shall say, a University of Chicago study, I don't know if many of you saw this, from the Becker-Friedman Institute, that showed that counties where people watched more Sean Hannity than Tucker Carlson had much worse health outcomes, because of course it took 2 or 3 extra weeks for Hannity to come to recognize reality. So that I thought was really a very interestingly and well-designed study, and you might imagine something like that in your case.
It's interesting. Morgan?
Yeah, so you touched a little bit about on the issue of decarceration and of sort of like the human rights issue of the COVID-19 in prisons and how many deaths there have already been. And I guess my question is just, can you elaborate a little bit more on that and give examples from around the world of how different states have responded to this issue? We've seen in Illinois the executive power being used, the executive power to grant clemency. And I'm wondering, are there examples of executive power being used in other countries? And as well, are there any legal mechanisms, do you think, in terms of international human rights, other than the use of executive power to sort of respond to the human rights issue of COVID-19 in prisons and of the plight of immunocompromised people who are incarcerated?
So yeah, I know that federal courts have demanded the release here. It's some of it's clemency, but it's also federal courts getting involved because of the conditions in the prisons, which they're already used to regulating. In other countries, we've seen, I haven't studied it systematically, but it is true that we've seen the same reaction in several other countries. There was prison riots in some countries and releases of nonviolent prisoners. But that's also led to backlash, as you might predict. So there's always a thing when the victims, of these particular prisoners are out there and the prisoner gets let out for their own, health concerns. That's created some backlash. So I think it's it's one of the general things that most states are confronting, though I don't have systematic data.
All right, and folks, also, we're having a lunch talk with David Fati, the director of the National Prison Project at the ACLU on Thursday. So he'll talk a lot about COVID and detention and incarceration. Anna?
Hi, yeah, so I just wanted to know if we have seen a reaction by the public to the invocation of emergency powers in countries, whether they're a democracy or not, maybe either historically or during this pandemic. Like, do people tend to respond in a mass scale, either through the media or through protests or whatever, to invoking emergency powers?
So actually, this is a very interesting question, because actually what we've seen is kind of the reverse. If you think about, just think back to where we were 6 months ago. There are many countries where there are massive protests going on. Chile, Lebanon, Algeria, lots of countries where people were really upset with their governments, with corruption, and there was really, government endangering levels of protests going on. And of course, COVID was a dream for those governments, right? Because all of a sudden people don't want to be on the streets. And that's, I think, a really interesting problem with it, that, what is the mechanism of protest? In normal circumstances, the ultimate weapon is that people go out on the streets together and overturn the government. But that obviously is not something people are going to do if that involves risking their lives. So I have not seen anything like we've had in the United States. I mean, there's no other country where you had armed protesters going into the State House, fully, wearing full militia gear. That would be seen by most other countries as truly insane. And it also seems to be that, from what I can tell, virtually everywhere, people are really, really afraid and so reluctant to take those steps. So I think it's had oddly and perversely the opposite reaction. Doesn't mean that there's not lawsuits, right, that are going on. The ones that have come to my attention tend to be in richer, European jurisdictions where there's a lot of tradition for civil liberties. Israel, Germany, and such, Spain, but they're not mass protests just using the usual channels, which, as I suggested, seem to be working in terms of calibrating things back.
Thank you.
Genevieve?
Sorry, hi, thank you. I was just interested in your law review article. Then you mentioned your debate with, is it Posner, about the rise of the executive? And I was just wondering about this idea of state of emergencies and whether it's the best example of, say, sovereign exceptionalism, if at the moment we're actually in the instance where we're in the situation that, say, it was designed for, as opposed to, say, maybe like immigration or Guantanamo, it might be a sort of different example of the executive increasing its power. I don't know if that makes sense, so please tell me if it does.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously this is the paradigm of an emergency, and that's one reason that the rule of law runs out. So think about, like, every country has a statute with calling for quarantine, right? But none of those statutes imagine a lockdown of an entire country, an entire population. Quarantine usually refers to a small specific area and a small specific number of people. And so now we're saying this, like, you know, challenge, where laws designed for that are being invoked to take much bigger steps. So it is the paradigm of an emergency. Now, I take your question to be that, like, hey, in the US, haven't we been, you know, gosh, Trump declared, you know, used the emergency language to repurpose money from one congressional pot of money to build the border wall, or to put sanctions, trade sanctions on China. That's under an emergency economic powers statute. So we throw around the term all the time. And I take your question to be that, like, maybe there's a danger in that because we normalize the use of the term emergency and thus might not be, you know, adequately, you know, monitoring those schemes. And I think to some degree that's right. There's a sort of theory that we've been in a state of emergency in one sense since 1946 or 1945, since World War II, that we've really never gotten out of in terms of the national security powers that exist in the United States, constrained through various mechanisms. So yeah, there may be an element of that, but this is in fact the true paradigmatic emergency. This is when we need these kind of powers.
Anna?
Hi, Professor Ginsburg. So I was wondering if you could actually expand a little bit on Anna's question. If mass protests are a thing that's, like, simply American, I guess I'm wondering, like, what it is about the American psyche that's leading to this protest, and if it is, maybe in the American context, it's not, like, as you said, you don't think it's that necessary right now because the lockdown isn't restricting our civil liberties as in other countries. But do you think these mass protests should be something that could be happening, that, like, should be happening in other countries? I guess I'm just, like, trying to understand, like, what sets us so much apart from the world where we are so angry at our, like, at being restricted, and is our psyche something dangerous and making it worse for us, or should other constituencies around the world kind of have, like, this, like, fired up conviction to go against, like, their more authoritarian governments?
Well, look, I do think, you know, mass protest is appropriate in Cambodia or Hungary, right? These are dictators, and so that's the only way you ever get rid of them. And it's a fight. And so, but obviously they have a lot of repressive capacity. In the United States, I attribute it to a couple things. Obviously, we have a libertarian streak in our political culture, right? That's just been the case since the beginning, and you know, that's just part of who we are. But, you know, if you think about it, there have been many instances in American history where we do all come together to take on big challenges and do so willingly. I mean, World War II and, you know, various other conflicts. And so I attribute it entirely to leadership and the media, you know, frankly, that you know, and I'll just say, I don't want to be partisan, but I'll just say a word about President Trump here. It's interesting. I read something pointing out that he has these kind of dual instincts. He's, in fact, a complete germaphobe. So he kind of was the perfect guy to lead us at this moment. If he had said, oh my God, no one shake anyone's hands, you know, we got to really take this germ thing seriously. But in fact, his messaging has been mixed, right? So on the one hand, the press conferences we've all seen, but then also the calls and the sort of incitement to these nut jobs who, you know, want to go protest in close social distance for political reasons. So that to me is it's really put fuel on the fire of libertarianism, which was already there. And I think it's not going to get better, and I'm pretty worried about it, honestly.
I want to offer actually an alternative to what might be the distinction between what's happening in the United States and, you know, if it's the case that the same kinds of protests aren't happening in the rest of the world. I'm not entirely convinced that our protesting is about the restriction of civil liberties by the government. I actually think it might be about the restriction of the civil liberties of certain regions in the United States that feel like they're being unfairly restricted to protect other regions of the United States that they don't care about. You know, I think this might have more to do with our internal politics, you know, and sort of the urban-rural divide. I say this purely anecdotally, and I know my students know that I've been trolling various Facebook groups on small businesses against the quarantine. And a lot of the language there is civil liberties related language, but it's more about people being restricted and deprived and having to make sacrifices for another part of the United States that they're unconnected to. So, you know.
Yeah, well, so that's, I mean, in a way it's consistent with my answer that in a polarized environment, right, that these things, you know, we haven't been brought together, right?
But we haven't seen, but I guess back to Anna's question, we haven't really seen protests on government overreach during the state of the emergency more generally anywhere, really, right?
No, I think you see civil libertarian protests in many European countries. So, you know, but that's, as I'm suggesting, I don't think those are the places where one needs to be the most concerned. But maybe that's just my own assessment of the deprivations and the steps that are necessary to take. If you think about it, like there's no right answer on the spectrum between total absolute lockdown where you get arrested if you walk outside your house and Sweden, right? And there's a whole range where it's all voluntary and only old people are kind of, you know, encouraged to stay home. There's not a right answer. We don't know. And it's not the case that we've learned much actually about the right level of restraint. And so if that's the case, then we can have a conversation about the right level, a rights-based conversation about the right level of restriction. That seems perfectly fine to me. And I think it is happening in a lot of countries. And I think it'll happen more as time goes on. I just worry, you know, with the additional factors of the United States with the, you know, all the guns and such, it does worry me a little bit. And also, of course, that the people who are protesting will themselves, you know, constitute a second or third wave. I also think, and I'll say it again, I don't think any of these restrictions have been particularly bad. If you think about what's happening in other countries, what I would be looking for is expansions of power, targeted repression, right? If a Democratic governor, you know, refused to let anti-abortion protesters show up, but allowed someone else, you know, that's the kind of thing I would say, well, that's really a rights violation in a fundamental way that we ought to be concerned about, but not what we're observing myself.
I'll go to Christy, but one thing, Christy and I were on the phone this morning with some colleagues in Spain, and we were told that Spain has started opening up and it's allowing people in certain age ranges to go outside of their houses at different times of the day. And I was thinking, Christy, you know, if the older people who have less attractive times are going to start complaining that the 20-year-olds get to go out at 7 a.m.
Yeah, right. Peru, by the way, I think is doing men and women, different days for men and women is what I heard.
So is Colombia. They're doing men and women as well.
Nice.
My question was also on the level of restraint conversation, but kind of in the other direction. So there have been some countries, I mean, maybe even including the US, that like haven't maybe had a national comprehensive response, or even who have like I think Tajikistan until maybe 5 days ago recognized that coronavirus like was a thing and that there maybe were some cases in the country, and how that interacts with people's rights. Because in terms of someone trying to protect themselves or have protection, that could influence that, but I'm not sure if there is much international like law protecting someone's right to be protected by their country. So
right.
I was just wondering in that direction.
So of course, conceptually there is, right? Because we tend to think of human rights can be violated by acts or omissions of governments. And so conceptually, the resources are there, but this is an area where, you know, maybe Posner's idea of the executive unbound is right, that we just have to, we recognize that there's a certain amount of necessary delegation to authorities to make these calls, and it's not really clear that the law can properly get involved. I did tell you about a couple of the Brazilian cases where the law has demanded responses that the government didn't want to give in the direction you're talking about, but I don't know that much, you know, that courts or even international human rights institutions can do much about, let's say, Belarus, which is a country where the president is pretending that the thing doesn't exist. It's just a media conspiracy. And, you know, they're going to go for the herd immunity strategy, sacrifice the old.
All right, Rachel.
Hi, Professor Ginsburg. So I'm not sure if this maybe falls under what you covered in terms of how you don't think there's that much to worry about because there aren't expansions of power and big rights violations, but I'm just wondering if you could speak a bit more to the proportionality analysis that you mentioned and sort of what you think that type of analysis would look like now, especially because there's so much that's still unknown about the virus, and whether sort of those unknowns would justify more or less restriction.
Yeah. Right. I mean, you know, the standard, it's true that we don't, it's hard to assess what level of restriction is required. But I think, you know, a good example is those German cases involving the right to protest. So the initial restriction was no gatherings, and thus a complete restriction of freedom of assembly. And then, you know, protesters said, no, we want to do it and we have a plan. This is local level cities which were doing this. They sort of, we have a plan for how we're going to do this. We're going to observe social distancing measures. And the city government said, no, you can't do it. So that's kind of one where you can really quite easily see that there is a less restrictive way of allowing them to protest, just be in the observe the social distancing measures. In general, of course, we're asking about, you know, is the government end an acceptable end? Clearly it is here. You know, is there a, you know, is the steps being taken a reasonable way of meeting the end? And clearly that's met. So it all comes down to that sort of balancing, the proportionality. Is there any other way you could achieve the important end of fighting COVID, which restricts rights less? And that's how the test is applied.
All right, Arya.
Hi, thank you, Professor. So I was wondering what this would mean for our presidential elections in November, especially since you mentioned Malawi and how that impacted what they were doing. But what kind of implications are there with respect to just obviously not being able to leave, and if it gets worse, especially towards winter?
You know, it's really interesting. You mean about holding the election, I assume?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So there's been a lot of speculation about this. My view is the politics are such that, you know, of course, it's actually done state by state. In states like Colorado, everyone votes by mail anyway. So that's perfectly plausible to do. And I don't see any real chance of postponing the election. I really don't. It's never happened. We've had elections through all the wars and such. And also, the people who are making that decision generally, you know, the Republicans don't want to postpone the election because low turnout always helps, right? So I don't see a politics lining up where we're going to get a true postponement. But there is an interesting legal question. What happens if we postpone the election? The president's term ends, period, on, you know, January 2021. So if we don't hold an election, then what law professors have been sort of focusing on is what happens. Well, he loses office and so does Pence. And we then go through the chain of presidential succession until we can hold a new election. And so that would be quite dramatic and interesting if it happened. But also that illustrates, again, why I think that there's not much real chance of postponing one, but turnout could be really low in some places. As you know, those of you who are in Illinois, I don't know if any of you vote here, but we did have this primary during the COVID virus, and there were some cases that were linked to some of those voting sites.
Nino?
Hi, I'm curious about, you know, this challenge of taking on Posner's argument about the executive unbound in times of emergency and how well, because I think obviously we talk often about it in the national security arena or like the war emergency, and there are differences when we're talking about something like the pandemic or a global pandemic. And one of the biggest reasons that courts tend to defer when we're talking about in a war context, right, is this question of intelligence and of information. And I wonder if you've thought or have seen some or try to kind of measure how that works out when we're talking about a health crisis, right? Where in a war or national security, there can be some plausible and real arguments made for why the executive has expertise and special access to information that he can't share and cannot be, given to courts or given to open sources in a way that doesn't quite map onto something like when we're talking about a pandemic where we're seeing, more information is better, although you can imagine regimes also, not sharing as much information as is out there. So how that kind of plays out, because that's probably one of the strongest arguments that you see when the US courts tend to defer to executive power in war, is this kind of executive expertise, not just that this kind of plenary constitutional power, but that we really don't want to make we don't want to second guess an executive that might know better. And in European countries where you see sometimes the courts push a little bit more, it's in cases where they make the executive kind of at least make that choice of either like divulge some of your information, or you can't have some of these powers, but you can't do both, where you claim sole authority to know everything and then sole authority to make all the decisions. And then the other, sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
No, the other one was kind of relatedly, which is I wonder how if your argument partly is that if we can't see kind of formal limits on executive power because we're not going to be able to articulate clear substantive limitations of an authority when we're talking about an emergency, and so we'll have to fall back on more principled kind of rule of law or more even like flexible standards like proportionality that allow us to kind of tailor our questioning to even post hoc to particular circumstances. I wonder if you thought, how does U.S. jurisprudence or U.S. constitutional law fare if those are the ways in which we think it's possible to kind of bind the executive, how U.S. constitutional law really fares compared to others?
It's a great set of questions. So the first point, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, this is a case where the government not only doesn't have better information, they might have worse information. Right. The University of Chicago, we got all these economists and such modeling, biostatisticians, epidemiologists, everyone, the expertise is not actually found in the government's hands on this one. And so that might, be a good response to my critique of the executive unbound. The executive unbound might apply in the national security area, but not others. So that's right. Now, how would U.S. constitutional law do? Well, I think not very well right now, because we're seeing in general, right, the Supreme Court has been very, very deferential to the president. They don't want to get involved in anything which reeks of any actual substantive, decision. They're not very creative in their jurisprudence in this area. Professor Huck and I actually, in the last book, we had this call for a special court or special bench for constitutional rights in the United States because they're so poorly protected by existing jurisprudence. So I don't think we would do particularly well. I'd much rather, if I was a civil libertarian, be living in Germany in that sense, because I think we get better jurisprudence, better reasoned jurisprudence there.
Yeah. All right, Eric.
So you started out by speaking about specifically political checks on the executive, and I was hoping you could return to what happened in Brazil. If you would label Bolsonaro's backing off as deference to the court in terms of rule of law, or as reaction to the court as a political institution and maybe as a choice not to use up political capital, if it's at all possible to tell one of those from the other.
Right. It's obviously really difficult to tell, but I think it is relevant that he is highly unpopular. He would have been impeached already probably, but for the fact that they suffered such a painful impeachment process with his predecessor, which brought him to power. So, and the fact that his vice president is a military general who's not seen as a really great guy. And so I think that there's just this really interesting dynamic that the political class has no respect for him, doesn't listen to him. And thus that gives him really very little freedom of movement. If he was to ignore the court and say, no, we're going to end this decree, we're ending the lockdown by decree anyway, despite what the court said. First of all, no one would listen to him because all the state governors have their own lockdowns. Secondly, that might be impeachable, ignoring the Supreme Court thing. So he just doesn't have much room to maneuver. And that might be a very contingent fact, which is, I think, the thrust of your question. It might not apply generally.
All right. Anyone else?
I actually had a quick follow-up on Anna's question, because this is something that keeps coming up and I think was discussed recently in Texas on the voting question, right? Because the bigger worry, I think, is not that they postponed the election. The bigger worry is that they don't make any accommodation for the pandemic, or like a lot of states don't, right? And so people kind of have to make this decision of go and risk your life or you can't vote. And whether there's been, I haven't looked into it, but whether there's been any sort of talk about whether you can force a state's hand to allow for like mail voting. I can't think of how, but.
So this is exactly, it goes back to your question as well. You could imagine a jurisprudence which said that there's a right to vote, and therefore we should encourage states to implement that right, and they should take X and Y reasonable steps in order to give people the chance to vote. Instead, the jurisprudence is we're going to defer to whatever creative vote suppression techniques the various states come up with, because it's not our job. Oh, but when Wisconsin, you want to postpone the election, no, you've got to do it under the previous terms, even though that clearly was going to infringe on many absentee voters' right to vote. So we have a terrible jurisprudence in this regard, and we don't need to. So it's really outrageous, frankly. It makes me very upset.
You're fair. You're not
All
alone.
right. On that note, thank you, Professor Ginsburg. Thanks, everyone, for showing up. And hopefully we'll see some of you on Thursday.
Yeah. Stay
All
safe,
right.
everybody.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.